What if silence itself could turn to venom? What if a feast, dressed in laughter and silver, was not a celebration, but a stage upon which centuries of cruelty came to taste its own ending? Virginia, 1854. The plantations still stood like monuments of arrogance, even as whispers of the coming war drifted across the fields. In the big house, crystal glasses clinked beneath chandeliers, and roasted meats filled the air with heavy smoke. Masters toasted their wealth, their lineage, their God-given right to rule. Yet only yards away, in the quarters, silence pressed like a chain around the throats of the enslaved. No chandeliers, only darkness. No feast, only scraps. Their hymn was not laughter, but a low hum of survival, carried in whispers, half prayers, half memories. It was here, in this silence, that Alice lived. She carried scars no feast could erase, lashes on her back, hunger in her belly, and grief that burned deeper than any flame. Her family was broken by the ledger. A brother sold to Mississippi, a mother buried too soon. The overseer's whip had marked her body, but the mistress's gospel had tried to mark her soul. Sermons of obedience, spoken by lips red with wine. The night of the feast was like all others. Arrogance at the table, silence in the shadows. But something shifted. A choice, small as a drop, carried heavier than any chain. Alice, the quiet figure. The year was 1854, a decade before the thunder of Civil War would rip through Virginia's soil. Yet even then, the land was heavy with contradictions. Virginia called itself the mother of statesmen, but it was also the mother of chains. Its fields bore not just tobacco and hemp, but the sweat and blood of the enslaved. Every row of crop was a line in a hidden ledger, where lives were measured in labor, obedience, and silence. The plantation stood as a world divided. At the crest of the hill rose the big house, white-painted and proud, a fortress of columns and polished windows. Within, velvet curtains dimmed the light, and portraits of ancestors stared down as if to remind all who entered that lineage mattered more than mercy. Below the hill stretched the fields, wide as an ocean, where enslaved hands bent to the soil from first light until dusk, and at the farthest edge, beyond sight of guests, huddled the quarters, wooden shacks leaning into one another like the weary bodies they contained. It was in one of these shacks that Alice drew breath each morning. Her life was carved by scarcity, food ladled thin, clothing patched from rags, sleep stolen between the cries of children and the shuffle of rats. Her back carried the whip's history, and her silence carried her family's grief. She had once known the sound of her brother's laughter, but he had been sold southward, a body converted into coin. Her mother, bent by years of toil, had collapsed in the fields one summer and never stood again. Alice was left with nothing but memory, and memory, on this soil, was as dangerous as flame. The overseer ruled the fields with his whip, a man whose cruelty was sharpened not by necessity, but by pleasure. Every lashing, every humiliation seemed to affirm his standing among the masters. And above him, in the shaded halls of the big house, sat the master and mistress. The master believed himself a patriarch ordained by heaven, though his books of account revealed the truth. He dealt in flesh as easily as tobacco leaves. The mistress read the gospel aloud on Sundays, preaching obedience to servants whose names she never spoke. Her lips trembled with piety as she recited, "Servants, obey your masters." Yet those same lips sipped wine, and her hands adorned themselves in silk that only bondage could buy. The hypocrisy was a daily theater. The enslaved gathered it in silence, for to speak against it was to invite the lash or the noose. But silence is not absence. It was a gathering force, a tide beneath the surface. In the evenings, when the fields released their weary workers, songs rose in the quarters, songs carried in whispers, filled with sorrow and longing, yet laced with something sharper, a rhythm of endurance, a language of survival. Alice listened, her heart moving to the unspoken notes. By 1854, Virginia's soil was restless. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had tightened the noose on freedom, ensuring that even escape offered no certainty. Runaways were hunted like animals, and those caught faced punishments too cruel to speak of. Yet rebellion lived in small acts, in broken tools, in slowed hands, in whispered prayers. For Alice, rebellion was not yet flame or scream. It was a thought carried in silence, waiting. She moved between two worlds. In the big house kitchen, she served with downcast eyes, carrying trays of food she could never eat. In the quarters, she nursed her wounds and counted the names of those stolen from her life. Every day, she stood on the threshold between obedience and defiance. And every day, the scales tilted closer toward something neither the overseer's whip nor the mistress's gospel could restrain. For Alice's silence was not submission. It was a gathering storm. The days that shaped the feast began like countless others, with the overseer's horn splitting the dawn. The quarters stirred, bodies dragging themselves into the thin morning mist. Alice rose from her straw pallet, with her stomach already hollow, the taste of yesterday's scraps still lingering on her tongue. Hunger was not an exception in her world. It was the steady companion of every hour. In the fields, the work was relentless. The overseer's whip coiled in his hand like a serpent, striking without warning. He lashed not only for lagging hands, but sometimes simply for the satisfaction of reminding the enslaved of their place. Children mocked from the veranda, imitating the cries of the whipped, their laughter a cruelty taught too young. Each humiliation landed heavier than the lash, for it was the reminder that even innocence here had been corrupted into mastery. Alice endured, though endurance had long stopped being passive. Every blow, every hunger pang, every insult was a spark. Yet sparks alone do not make a fire. They need dry timber, a gathering of silence, and a moment when the weight of cruelty tips the balance. That timber was laid in small acts of arrogance. The mistress demanded that Alice kneel while presenting water, as though Alice's hands themselves were unworthy to rise higher. The master forcing her to recite verses from the Gospel of Paul on obedience, watching to see if her tongue faltered on words that chained her. Each act was a rehearsal, a tightening of the coil. In the quarters at night, whispers moved through the dark. Songs carried grief, but also memory. Elders spoke in low tones of rebellions past, the Stono River in South Carolina, Nat Turner's rising in Virginia decades before. These were not stories told to inspire open revolt, but reminders that bondage was not eternal, that silence could one day split. Alice listened. She said little. Her silence was not emptiness. It was preparation. The season turned to harvest, and with it came the promise of celebration. The master planned a feast, one of those nights where candles lit the big house and carriages carried guests from neighboring plantations. Wine would flow, and the tables would groan with roasted meat and sugared confections. Such nights were meant as displays of power, where the masters congratulated one another on their dominion over both land and life. But for those who served, these nights were torment. They worked double in the kitchens and halls, preparing food they would never taste, watching laughter that mocked their hunger. The feast was announced weeks ahead, and the quarters buzzed with its approach. Some prayed for the night to pass quickly. Others feared it, for such gatherings often led to harsher punishments. Drunken guests treating enslaved women as part of the entertainment, or overseers emboldened to cruelty by their master's indulgence. For Alice, the announcement of the feast was not merely dread, it was clarity. She had carried within her a silence too long, a silence heavy with scars and graves. The feast would bring every face of her oppressors together in one room, their arrogance gathered under one roof, their mouths open wide for indulgence. What better stage could silence choose to break itself? In the days leading to the feast, the kitchen became a world of its own. Fires burned hot from morning until night. Pots of stews thick with spice, cakes rising golden in the oven, meat turning slowly on spits. Alice worked among other enslaved women, their hands a blur, their backs bent, their sweat feeding the abundance that would never feed them. She moved quietly, carrying trays, grinding herbs, pouring wine. Her eyes never lifted in defiance, yet behind them her mind was sharp. Among the shelves lay jars, roots, powders, tinctures. Some were meant for healing, others for pest control. In the blurred knowledge passed down through enslaved communities, women knew what leaves could soothe a fever and what berries could stop a heart. Alice's mother had whispered some of this knowledge to her in childhood, words carried carefully, for such knowledge was both shield and danger. The wrong ear could call it witchcraft, the right hand could make it justice. It was a day in the kitchen, 2 days before the feast, that Alice's hand lingered too long over a jar. A bitter root, ground fine. To the unknowing, it was medicine. To those who understood, it was a threshold between breath and silence. She lifted it, weighed it in her hand. A decision formed, not as sudden fury, but as something long planted, now grown to its season. A night of the feast came. Carriages rattled into the yard, lanterns glowing. Music spilled from the big house, violins and laughter weaving into the night. Guests arrived in silks and broadcloth, their voices raised in toasts of wealth. The table stretched long, candles casting light across roasted hams, candied fruits, and pies steaming with spice. The master stood at the head, his hand raised, proclaiming his house blessed, his family favored, his dominion secure. And in the shadows of the kitchen, Alice moved, trays balanced in her hands, goblets filled under her care. She poured wine, her motions practiced, her face unreadable. Into certain cups, into certain dishes, her silence slipped something else. Not enough to taste, not enough to smell, just enough to let the feast carry its own ending. As laughter swelled in the dining hall, the quarters outside fell quiet. Some sensed the air shift, though they could not say why. Songs that night carried a different tone, lower, slower, like a tide waiting for the moon's command. Inside, the feast burned brighter. Glasses clinked, knives scraped plates. The master laughed, the mistress smiled, the guests toasted. No one noticed the hand that moved among them, silent as memory, steady as grief. The sparks were set. The dry timber waited. And as the night deepened, silence prepared to speak. The feast reached its height beneath a ceiling of glittering chandeliers. Candles burned low, wax dripping like pale tears down their stems. The master lifted his glass, his voice swelling with pride. He praised his land, his lineage, his God, his feast. And in the reflection of polished silver, he saw only triumph. The laughter of the table filled the hall, but beneath it came another sound, so faint at first it seemed like nothing more than the scrape of a chair. A cough. One guest, flushed from wine, pressed a hand to his chest. Another followed, laughter breaking into confusion. Knives fell against porcelain. Eyes darted. Coughs multiplied, louder, harsher, until they began to sound like the gasps of drowning men. The mistress's hand trembled as she set down her cup. A sheen of sweat formed on her brow. Her lips, painted red for the feast, parted in a sudden spasm. Across the table, the master's brother lurched forward, choking, his face twisting, as if the very air had betrayed him. The violinist faltered, bow sliding across strings, the music collapsing into a wail. Panic spread like wildfire. Chairs scraped back. Silver clattered. Voices rose in alarm. Servants rushed forward, their eyes wide, but their faces unreadable, caught between fear of discovery and something darker, a recognition. For once, it was not the enslaved who knelt gasping, but the masters. Alice moved among them, steady as the tide. Her steps made no sound against the polished floor. To the eye, she was still the servant, refilling cups, clearing plates. But her silence was no longer obedience. It was the silence of judgment. The master clutched his stomach, his boastful voice strangled into a hoarse cry. He tried to rise, but his legs buckled. The mistress collapsed into her chair, her silk dress pooling around her like spilled wine. Guests stumbled for the doors, their footsteps staggering, their voices breaking into shrieks. The chandeliers swayed as if the house itself trembled. In the chaos, the big house no longer seemed invincible. Its walls did not echo with command, but with confusion. Its portraits of ancestors stared blankly as their legacy crumbled. The feast meant to display power, had become a theater of collapse. Alice's eyes lifted once, only once, as the master fell. In that gaze, there was no triumph, no laughter, only the quiet weight of history pressing through her. For this was not vengeance of the moment. It was the voice of generations. A ledger written in blood and lashings, finally balancing itself. The fire of rebellion did not always roar in flames. Sometimes it was a whisper slipped into a goblet, a silence that turned the master's feast into his ruin. The house stood tall on lies. The poison spoke truth. The morning after the feast, the big house was no longer a palace of triumph, but a husk of confusion. Its windows, once glowing with candlelight, stood dim. Servants moved through its halls in silence, carrying away bowls of food gone cold, cups overturned, and chairs left abandoned in chaos. Yet the silence was not like the silence of before. It carried weight, a new heaviness that pressed against every beam of wood and every stone of the foundation. The master lay in his chamber, fevered and pale, his voice reduced to broken gasps. Some said he lingered for days. Others whispered he was gone before the dawn. The mistress clutched her children, trembling, praying loudly to the God she had once invoked as a weapon of obedience. Her prayers rang through the hall, yet they sounded hollow, as if heaven itself refused to listen. Outside, the quarters buzzed with rumors. The enslaved spoke in whispers, careful that their words did not travel to the overseer's ears. They asked one another. The overseer moved through the yard with suspicion, his whip dangling at his side, though even he seemed unsettled. Authority relied on fear, but something deeper had taken root in the soil. The knowledge that silence could strike back. He searched for Alice, yet whether she was dead, fled, or hidden by others, no record could confirm. In the plantation ledgers, her name appeared and then disappeared, a gap that no account explained. Decades later, when the war finally came and the Union's march broke the chains across Virginia, the plantation lay in ruin. The big house still stood, but its paint had peeled, its windows cracked, and vines curled over its columns. Visitors walking the grounds spoke of the night of the feast in hushed tones. Some said the floors of the dining hall carried stains that no scrubbing ever erased. Others said that if one stood in the kitchen at night, the air still carried the faint bitterness of something steeped too deep. In the quarters, only fragments remained, broken hearthstones, rotted wood, the ghosts of songs once hummed beneath a starlit sky. Yet, in those ruins lived memory. For among the descendants of the enslaved, Alice's story passed not as written fact, but as whispered inheritance. They spoke of her as one who had faced the unfaceable, who had turned her silence into judgment. Some called her a shadow, others a savior. The truth was never settled. Historians searching the archives found little, only a sudden note of illness in the master's family, a record of guests who died too soon, and a line struck through a name in a ledger. Official accounts smothered her story in silence, for the written word belonged to those who feared it. But the unwritten endured, carried in memory, in legend, in the way her name was spoken only when the night was deep and the doors were closed. Time blurred the edges of fact and story. Was Alice caught and hanged, her body buried in unmarked soil? Did she flee north, vanishing into the folds of freedom, carried by the Underground Railroad? Or did she linger, hidden among her own, her silence transforming into song? The answers dissolved like smoke, leaving only echoes. And so the story of Alice endures, not as history records it, but as history resists being silenced. A reminder that even in chains, silence is not submission. It waits, it gathers, and when the time comes, it speaks in a voice the masters cannot answer. The big house crumbled. The feast was forgotten in ledgers. But the legend remained, whispering through the fields like wind through dry tobacco leaves. What is truth when silence tells its own story? What is freedom when memory refuses to die?